Hello, everybody. My name is Katarzyna Chmielewska. I am from Institute of Literary Research of Polish Academy of Science, and I'm also a member of local committee of MSA. Welcome in Warsaw, all participants of the 5th Annual Conference of Memory Studies Association Convergences. We are in Museum of History of Polish Jews, Polin. My co-chair is Paweł Dobrosielski. Hello, Paweł. From Institute of Polish Culture of University of Warsaw. Would like to invite you to see new exhibition of work by Wilhelm Sasnal, Such a Landscape, Taki Pejzaż. With us, our curator of the exhibition, Adam Szymczyk. Hello, Adam. And one of the most important contemporary art critic, Luisa Nader. Hello, Luisa. Adam Szymczyk is curator and writer. He lives in and works in Basel and Zurich. He was artistic director of the Documenta 14 between 2019 and 2081. He held seminars, Principle of Equality and Undoing Landscape at the Academy of Fine Arts, Vienna. Correct, I suppose. And Luisa Nader is art historian, professor at the Academy of Fine Arts in Warsaw. Her research is focused primarily on modern and contemporary art, memory discourse, theories of the affect. Currently, she is working on the visual notations, artifacts, reports, and testimonies from and of the Holocaust in Poland. Guys, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm really pleased and honored to be here, and thank you for your invitation, and I will start. I will tell you a few words about the site we are in. So we are in Warsaw, in Muranów district, which is a very specific location. It's a vulnerable, fragile texture of memory and remembering that must be constituted again and again. And namely, we are in post-Warsaw Ghetto space. The Warsaw Ghetto was closed by the Germans on the 16th of November 1940. And in its peak point, there were about 450,000 Jews imprisoned here. They were suffering terror, extreme violence, executions, murders. They were dying of diseases and starvation. And between 22nd of July and 21st of September 1942, so-called Grossaktion Warschau took place. It was an extermination process. About 300,000 of Jewish men, women, and children from the ghetto were transported from Platz to Treblinka death camp, and they were murdered. Can we stop here, Kasia, for a moment? Now you're seeing the monument to the ghetto heroes from 1948 by Nathan Rapaport and Leon Marek Suzin. And this monument commemorated the 5th anniversary of the outbreak of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising took place on the 19th of April 1943, and it lasted for about a month. After the fall of the uprising, the Warsaw Ghetto was completely destroyed by Germans, ruined and burned to the ground. After the war, Muranów district was literally built on these ruins. So we can say that Warsaw Ghetto is a perished city, but it exists in fragments, in crumbles and traces. And these fragments, crumbles and traces, they form an ethical imperative for a place in our living and acting memory. We can go on with the film. And one of the idioms of this living and acting memory is the Polin Museum as the institution. Polin Museum is facing the Ghetto Heroes Monument. It was officially opened in 2013, and I think it's one of the most important institutions, cultural institutions in Poland at the moment, and perhaps in Europe. It presents 1000 years of Jewish life and culture in Poland, but also it is a place of dialogue, of historical reflection, of building memory and knowledge, but it is also a place of protest, of dissent, very much needed now in Poland, dissent against anti-Semitism, all forms of xenophobia, repressions and violence directed toward ethnic and sexual minorities. Adam. You are mute, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry. We are just entering the exhibition, and this is the first work, which is difficult to overlook because it's very, very large and kind of welcomes you right at the entrance. Could we stop here for a second? So it's perhaps symptomatic for the way we're going to be looking at other paintings in the show, and we're going to employ something that is often referred to as hermeneutics of suspicions, to look at works of art. So the context that Luisa described makes us read paintings in a particular way if we don't know what is their subject proper. In this case, those barrack-like buildings are actually pigsties, which were abandoned after the collective farms in Poland were privatized and sort of economically lost the battle. There are many empty buildings of that kind dotting the landscape of Polish countryside, and the artist chose two of them to portray them in this rather monumental painting. Please continue the film. Could you please? Yes, thank you. And you also see one rather atypical thing in this show, that the paintings are not installed on white walls, but they are installed on a special architectural structure that has been covered with very thin sheet of metal. And therefore, our presence vis-a-vis these paintings becomes very palpable, very tangible. And the paintings are sort of jumping off the wall rather than being comfortably, set and splayed for us to view them. Now we are entering a section of the exhibition where we have a bunch of works that we're gonna spend some time with, and one of them is a painting that we have just passed, which is called Poland and Israel, and then there's another painting which is a portrait of Hitler. But we are going to go back to these paintings. Now we have a more like an overview situation of the exhibition. As you see, it is organized through these walls and spaces that are of different sizes, and they have different width as well. And very often the architecture is forcing us into a very close contact vis-a-vis one or another painting. So we are not allowed to, in this exhibition, to take a comfortable distance in most of the spaces created through this new architecture by a Berlin-based architect, Johanna Meyer-Grobrugge. The invitation for Wilhelm Sasnal to organize an exhibition at the Museum of History of Polish Jew came some time ago, and then I joined as a curator of the show on invitation of the artist and the museum. The museum, I suppose, invited Sasnal because it was known that he, in his work, addressed many times the subject of the Holocaust, but also a larger complex of anti-Semitism in Poland and elsewhere, and also all forms of xenophobia and racism were very often touched upon in his works indirectly, or sometimes quite directly, like for instance in these two works there are posters created for the sort of anti-fascist organization in Poland called Never Again. And Sasnal created two works that were sold, and the benefit from the sales went to this organization that is documenting that is documented racist violence in Poland today. And this is another large drawing that we're going to talk about in more detail later, and that is representing a history of a sort of fictional Jewish family in the city of Tarnów, from which the artist is coming. But we're gonna go back to this work later, and we're gonna discuss it in more detail. I would like to talk a little bit about the way Sasnal approaches historical subjects, and he does so often quite indirectly and through abstract forms. So this monument that Luisa showed in the very beginning is an early monument commemorating the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto. It's been created in 1948, and it's in this early monument, what is very striking is an abstract form of a sort of large block or cube in which there are figurative and symbolic sculptures sort of inserted. But later on in European artists, when they try to approach the subject of Holocaust, they very often reverted to abstract form, because somehow the figuration was not the right language to use, especially after it was hijacked in the sort of pompous neoclassicism of the Nazi sculpture and painting. So figuration became a kind of taboo, and it took a long while before artists could speak about this dramatic and horrifying historical events through the language which was not abstract. And definitely Sasnal, who is the next generation after the Holocaust, was able to go back to some form of figuration, however heavily compromised and under a big question mark, in order to address the history. And we're gonna see it in some of the works that we're gonna look at in more detail. Luisa?
Yeah, if I might add something, yeah. So I just would like to add to what Adam just said, that there's a constellation of research, literature, films, and visual art pieces to which Wilhelm Sasnal relates. And let me enumerate just 5 names. Jan Tomasz Gross, with his 2 books, Neighbors, The Destruction of the Jewish Community in Jedwabne, and Fear, Antisemitism in Poland After Auschwitz. Claude Lanzmann, Showa, Art Spiegelman's Mouse, and Tadeusz Borowski's short stories. So I think it is impossible to think about Polish landscape beyond, in Wilhelm Sasnal works, beyond violence, beyond Szymon Srebnik's famous phrase from the very beginning of the Lanzmann's film, es ist schwer zu erkennen, aber es war hier. So I would say that Sasnal is very much involved in constructing and reconstructing individual and cultural memory, but he's also analyzing, exposing, and disarming very poisonous social and cultural constructs of remembering. Adam? You have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, and in order to approach history, he employs landscape, which is a genre that seems dated, banal, and politically neutral at first. And through the landscape, he approaches larger reality in painting. Faced with historical horror, one of possible reactions is to relinquish art, of course. especially in the situation when art is being appropriated by those who are in power, as it is in Poland now. But another reaction is to try to cope with the situation and to propose a vision that goes beyond the reality we are living right now. And this painting is a good example of that. And it's called Poland, Israel, and it's a painting which is maybe 20 years old now. I think from 1999 or 2000, and it kind of proposes a new type of geography where Poland is simply bordering Israel. And it is very striking because it took me a long time to think beyond the notion that Israel in this painting is in place of where Germany is now. And I think, you know, we have to think about it as a sort of relative, because we could also see it as Poland being sort of attached to the eastern border of Israel, actually in the place where Jordan is right now in the political geography of the region. So suspended in a kind of formless or placeless reality, these two countries are hovering in a kind of another map of the world yet to exist. And this is the portrait of Hitler, which is the only representation of Adolf Hitler that we have in the exhibition. And you have to believe me that this is a portrait of Hitler, because it has been very thoroughly painted over and covered with very thick impasto blotches of paint. And then finally it was also crossed with this diagonal little piece of wood that was attached to the surface of the canvas, and to make it sort of without doubt that this is a representation of Adolf Hitler that has been crossed. And would you like, could you please stop the film now, because I would like to share my screen for a moment, if possible. No, I think it's not possible. Just a second. Yes, it is possible. Okay, do you see the drawing? Okay, so basically this is the painting, the crossed portrait of Hitler is also referring to this very, let's say, advanced and visionary project of the monument for Auschwitz that was proposed by an architect and urban planner and artist, Oskar Hansen, during the first competition for Auschwitz monument that was chaired by Henry Moore in the late 1950s. So Hansen and Zofia Hansen, his partner, and other members of their team proposed a monument which is a tarmac road that crosses the camp diagonally, completely ignoring the rational master plan of the camp designed by Nazi planners. So basically there is no monument as a kind of focal point. There is only the experience of walking this road and crossing the camp and sort of meandering probably between the sides of the barracks and finally approaching in the left top corner the site of the crematorium. And in Hansen's idea, the site should not be preserved, so the barracks and parts of the camp infrastructure should not be preserved actively, but it should be left to nature to be slowly devoured, and slowly the road crossing the camp would remain as the only permanent feature of that landscape that would turn into nature. It would be kind of returned over time to nature. And I think that this sort of thinking that is very much present in this country, Poland, since the immediate post-war time, is very much informing the way Wilhelm Sasnal is working. So I stopped sharing, and if you could please go back to the film, and we're gonna move to other works. Thank you. Yes, so this is the portrait of Hitler that is actually telling us also, like in a famous painting by René Magritte, that this is, you know, representing a pipe, that this is not a pipe. So this painting, which obviously is not representing anything recognizable, is titled Hitler, to tell us that he might have been represented on this painting, but it's not anymore. So in a way, this painting is also something that in the Hellenistic period in the Roman Empire's art was called damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory, where basically a person who fell out of grace in a given social context had their monuments destroyed or defaced. And this process of defacing, destroying monuments, that was obviously an active form of erasing the memory of a person, has its name damnatio memoriae. And I think that the action that Wilhelm took towards the portrait of Hitler that he previously painted is exactly in the line of this sort of damnatio memoriae procedure known in art at least since 2000 years. Okay, we can continue. And yeah, we're gonna look at this painting. It looks a little bit like a sundial this way as the light is changing. In this work, I think we are done with this one. We can move to the next one. And the next set, I think it's yours, Luisa. Yeah, okay.
So maybe it's good to comment upon what Adam has just talked about, that I think that for Sasnal, memory is always a performance, an intervention, or a labor, which is taking place in the present, but it considers the past. And I think that this wall is a very good example of such thinking, memory as intervention. Can we just stop here for a second? So at this wall, you will see a passage of portraits, or rather of subject positions and social constructs, perhaps, and also of affects connected to memory and history. So this is a portrait of Gabriel Narutowicz, who was the president of in pre-war Poland, and he was supported by the left and ethnic minorities, among others. And he was assassinated in December 1922 on the stairs of Art Gallery Zachęta in Warsaw by the painter who was far-right extremist. We can go on with the film. And as you see, Narutowicz portrait is painted after the photography. It is veiled with dark yet slightly transparent paint, as if it was a kind of symbolic act of political mourning or an enunciation of an homage. You will see in a second a painting titled Partisans. And partisans in Polish historiography are highly mythologized. They are still perceived and as heroes. They were and they are still perceived as heroes. However, historical studies have shown that some of them were highly anti-Semitic. They attacked civilians, and many times they killed Jews. We can stop here for a moment. And this portrait, as you see, is representing partisans in a very unheroic way. They are shown as hollow, cold, indifferent, and somehow inhuman figures. They are painted after the photography from the book, and these are partisans from Sasnal's hometown. We can go on. And there you see a painting with the word strach, which means fear. It was painted after the publication of Fear by Jan Tomasz Gross, and a painting, it's an iteration of the figure of a Pole from Art Spiegelman's Mouse. And again, we see fear. As you remember, Fear, the book on Jan Tomasz Gross, is dedicated to brutal anti-Semitism in post-war Poland. And first of all, it is dedicated to Kielce pogrom, which took place on the 4th of July, 1946. And I would say that in these two paintings, well, in the portrait of a Pole as a pig and in Landscape of Fear, Sasnal counters the very general politics of history, where Poles are shown as innocent victims. Can we just stop here? Or rescuers of Jews during the Holocaust. So in this Landscape of Fear and in this portrait of a Pole as a pig, he rather highlights the position of the Polish bystander as death helper or beneficiary or betrayer. And here you see the portrait of the translator from Claude Lanzmann's film, Showa. It's Barbara Janicka. We can go on with the film. And as you see, her face is blurred, distorted. Perhaps we can project our own identities on her face. So we may say that he portraits not really Barbara Janicka. We can stop here for a second, but he portraits her anxiety or our emotional drift or fallen attempts to mediate between languages, liminal experiences, affects, and various subject positions such as victim, post-victim, bystander, post-bystander, perpetrator, death helper, etc. We can go on. Yes, a moment to project your subject position. So I think what Sasnal is looking for, thinking through his painting, are blind spots, spaces obscured, places producing anxiety and creating fissures within national self-image of narcissistic well-being. And the images you will see here are reiterated and changed, and that they derive from the very basic national visual symbolic universe. So you will see in a moment a heroic Pole on the horse, a nobleman, an aristocrat, however, with no face. Sasnal erased his face. He painted it after 19th century realistic painter Piotr Michałowski. And you will see in a moment a Highlander with all the mythology of masculinity, force, and independence. Here, again, slightly erased and blurred. And in a moment, you will see the landscape, Krakow, Warsaw. It's one of my favorites. And I think this kind of landscape is very symptomatic for Sasnal. You will see it in the moment. So this landscape, we can stop here for a second, is produced by a blink of eye, a blink of memory, or the moment of recognition. So the artist is looking through the window of the train and he encounters the gaze of the man working in the dark, brownish field who's burning something. And you can see an uncanny shape coming out of the ground. And I think that this kind of images, banal, I would say, perhaps could be called after Freud, Deckerinnerungen, screen memories. Screen memory is not a false memory. It both covers and uncovers something which happens to be painful or liminal experience. As Michael Rothberg suggested, screen memory is always multi-layered, multi-directional, and connected to many events and experiences on the spiral of time. And such images function like a screen. They hide something behind, and they are also a place where various emotions, affects, anxieties, and sensations or excluded experiences could be projected. We can go on with the film. And there you see showa, forest on the left. I would say that in this painting, Sasnal both supports and fortifies some aspects of Claude Lanzmann film. You see these little figurines. This is the translator, Barbara Janicka, Jan Piwoński, Polish bystander, and Claude Lanzmann during the interview in Sobibór death camp. However, as you see, the most important persona in this painting is the forest, the landscape. It dominates the representation, and it's painted in the most active way with a wide dynamic brushstrokes. So we can say that the forest is represented here as an active agent, or even more as a historical, non-human, yet moral witness. And then on the right, you see one of my favorite paintings. It is untitled, but the artist commented on this painting in this way. The eye swallows the landscape gorges the eye. So you see the monstrous eye, which is literally devastating, melancholic Polish landscape. And I think it's a very good metonymy for something I would call Polish symbolic universe. But on the other side, the eye belongs to the landscape. We can stop here. The eye belongs to the landscape. They are mutually related to each other. So this action also blinds the eye. It blinds the eye, but not the subjectivity behind it. And further on, you will see how it is to represent with your eyes wide shut. Adam, unmute yourself.
Thank you for advising me to unmute myself. Yeah, I think that these paintings demonstrated that fantasies of belonging and fantasies of finding origins in whatever landscape end up in kind of genocidal drive, and this Polish landscape that has been a locus of projection of nationhood has been also an actual site of crime throughout. So this is what these paintings are trying to probe. But this is another work that is maybe proposing the only, I would say, optimistic or positive vision, however, so far untrue. Well, why not have visions? Which is a story of a fictitious family, Kengold, who are Jews in Tarnów, and they arrive in 1927 when there is like industrial plants, nitrogen production plants being built in Tarnów, and they sort of open up their own company called KMG and start doing business. And then sorry, let's go back 1 second. It's too long a story to tell quickly, and I'll be yes. Just let's stop here for yes, exactly here. So basically, this is like a diagram that shows like different turns of fate of that family, but it's 20th century history until I think actually the year 2029. So it's kind of looking towards the future. But the Second World War and the Holocaust did not happen. So this family is participating in the movement, which ends up in like setting up different forms of organizations, and among them kibbutzim in Poland, and then they kind of, they have a normal life like a family, and at certain point there is a big modern synagogue built sometime in the end of 20th century. So this is going completely against the actual history of the city of Tarnów, where the Jewish ghetto was liquidated, and there are virtually no Jews in Tarnów. And Sasnal is drawing this sort of ahistorical panorama in which there is actually a possibility for Jewish life to flourish in Tarnów and in Poland. Okay, let's move on. And we move to another work that is kind of the reality, which is, this is a sort of twin painting called Density of Population, or Population Density. And it's painted after two diagrams, one from 1972 and the other one from 1990, showing density of population in the heartland of the country, which is somehow between the town of Kielce, where the post-war pogrom took place, in which over 50 Jews were killed, and then the city of Tarnów, where the artist is coming from, and then Krakow and Lodz. So this part of Poland is particularly charged with historical memory, and specifically the memory of Holocaust and the post-war sort of persecution of the survivors in Poland. Okay, we can move on now. Yeah, well, this is again two paintings that are like film stills, and they are the newest works, the most recent works in the show, and it's 1st of January. Could you stop, please? 1st of January 2021, and upon returning from a New Year's Eve party, the artist and his wife Anka were passing by Auschwitz, because the road went through Oświęcim or Auschwitz, and they stopped right in front of the gate. And Wilhelm, who was driving, took a couple of photographs, and on one of these photographs you see Anka looking straight in the direction when they are driving, and on the other photograph she's looking towards her right hand side, straight into the gate of the camp. So you have these two axes, which are also, let's say, the axis of memory and experience somehow, but here completely mixed. So somehow the axis of memory crosses the axis of experience, and even the movement freezes for a moment. So it's like a moment where the historical time and the now time collapse into each other. And then you have this very fine detail, which is a reflection of the landscape in the car mirror that is showing a kind of, what is still there, but already a past. So this is like a possibility of another landscape sort of contained within this very densely packed canvas. Maybe we're gonna see also the second canvas. So you see the very subtle change of the position of the subject portrait. In this case, her looking towards the gate while the car is moving in another direction, which kind of makes you think also of the idea of progress and the idea of forgetting as well. And then there is this moment when something unexpected breaks into this otherwise smooth process of experiencing, progressing, and forgetting while doing so. Yeah, there is a landscape here which is not really recognizable, but it's somehow fitting in a kind of typology of let's say Polish landscape, which has been very well described in the rather pioneering book on the landscape and memory by Simon Schama in the mid-90s or early 90s, where basically the significance of sites was considered, but the book was more looking into forests and the land as sites of memory, the unspecific sites, more like formations which condition the memory. Okay. Here we have a very narrow corridor in which on the right-hand side you have a painting of a landscape. On the left-hand side you have a short dialogue which goes more or less like show your hands, look, come closer. So there's two characters, and this is a dialogue from a short story by Tadeusz Borowski, who was the survivor of Auschwitz, and after the war he wrote two collections of short stories, and then he committed suicide. And Wilhelm Sasnal painted this landscape based on a very brief, very terse description of a landscape outside of Auschwitz camp in one of the short stories by Tadeusz Borowski. And this is the place where this dialogue is sort of taking place between two individuals that were sort of omitted from the landscape, and the dialogue itself was moved to another canvas that is now facing the landscape. So you have this junction between the site and the words spoken in this site, which kind of reflects the partial impossibility of true reconstruction of what happened and where it happened and who were the protagonists. So beyond those generalizations, we can hardly move. On the one hand, we have a dialogue that was recorded in a way through the work of literary fiction. On the other hand, we have a landscape that is evoked out of that literary fiction, but at the same time we're referring to the actual landscape of the surroundings of Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration and extermination camp. Okay, we're gonna move towards the final part of our presentation now, I think.
I would just say one sentence. We were talking about this situation when you represent with your eyes wide shut, and for a very few seconds you can look at this untitled painting. It's an after image, and this is the liminal representation. This is an image you see on your eyelids, and I will come back to it later. Unmute yourself.
Unmute. Yes, so this is a painting from early 2001, and then repainted in 2015. So there are 4 paintings, including this pig bowl portrait that Luisa showed earlier, that refer to the cartoon of Art Spiegelman, Mouse, that was published in Poland, I think around the year 2000 or maybe a little bit earlier. And it produced quite a debate, let's say, and it was vehemently, rejected by some and considered to be a masterpiece by others. And Sasnal obviously, looked at and read into this cartoon, and then he made 4 paintings where he eliminated the protagonists. So in Spiegelman's story, Poles are pigs, Germans are cats, and Jews are mice. So here in this picture from the barrack of a concentration camp, there are 2 protagonists, 2 mice, and one of them is handing out a piece of bread to the other. And they are having a little dialogue over this. And here in the painting, the protagonists and the dialogues disappeared, only the settings are left. And this painting, it was just a piece of wall and a piece of floor, but then 15 years later, Sasnal decided to add a few other elements, and he used actual nails, spoons and forks as stencils that he sprayed over to create these sort of ghostly appearances of very simple objects thrown away or scattered on the floor. And then he painted some light, but then he sort of obliterated this light with two dark blots or dots. And this painting is of a river, Ner, which is the opening scenes of Shoah that Luisa was talking about before. As you may remember, Landsman is being taken on a boat ride on the Ner River by Szymon Srebrnik, who is singing a song, a kind of Polish pre-war song that has to do with certain memories, perhaps, and which is very touching. And here, Sasnal painted the trees that reflect in the surface of the water of that river in a sort of reverse, and also in such a way that they might be reminiscent of, for instance, a sound wave, sort of echoing or resounding in space. So this is actually the last small picture in the exhibition. It's a kind of closing image of the show. Okay, we can move on and move towards the end of our presentation, I suppose. So the idea behind using this sort of reflecting background was to also introduce a kind of contingency in the process of viewing of the show, where shapes or reflections of visitors would be always parallel with paintings themselves. And this is another painting of the pigsty, similar to the one that opened the exhibition, where basically you see also there is a kind of like second landscape built into this wall on the left-hand side. It kind of opens up. And here we go to the after image, and I leave it to Luisa to discuss further. Thank you.
Okay, so I just mentioned the fact that an after image is a liminal representation conceived with your eyes shut wide. And it is created after looking into the burning light of the sun or the very strong source of the light. And then the spectator closes her or his eyes. So we can stop here. We may say it is an operatic situation when the moment of the literal seeing is a moment of blindness, and the moment of non-seeing turns the possibility of visualizing an extreme event beyond any kind of representation, imagination, or knowledge. So I perceive this image as an image in spite of all. Yes, and of course, Sasnal here is also playing with various representations in his art. You will recognize the traces of, for example, Andrzej Wróblewski's art, and here he's relating to Władysław Strzemiński, an avant-garde artist, one of the very few who both as a Polish bystander and as an implicated subject responded to Shoah and to post-war pogroms in Poland in his war drawings and in his series of collages to my friends, the Jews, from 1945, 1947. So it is a liminal representation. It is a kind of interplay with Strzemiński practice. And first of all, it is an image in spite of all. Adam, would you like to add something? But first, unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
Yeah, now it's okay. I'm sorry. So basically, in this exhibition, the premise of this show is that the only way to address histories is to address the past in such a way as if it were not clearly visible, and to approach or touch this past by means of something else, to find like another object through which to speak about the past and about history, and not to represent it directly, because it's very difficult to name and maybe nearly impossible to picture. So this there's a kind of drive towards formlessness in this show, which maybe culminates in this painting. And the formlessness is a means to perhaps draw contours of the trauma, which defines our lives until this day, living in this country. And it will continue to do so, but I think it's sometimes useful, and this is where art can have some social function, let's say, to stage these scenes and to speak about the subject matter without naming it directly, but invoking it through representations, while being aware that these are merely representations and not the exact depiction or analysis of the facts. So it's a form of a tale that is being told to us, and this is what the exhibitions are for. They are sort of departing from some truth and drifting away towards things that are not necessarily so true. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louisa and Adam, for this interpretational tour. Very interesting, both in film and in the commentary. And now I would like to ask all the participants to ask questions, to attend the Q&A session. Please write your questions in the Q&A option in the Rifta. I suppose we can have questions both to Sasnal exhibition and to Louisa's and Adam's interpretation of the exhibition, and some questions, extended questions on the situation between Sasnal's work and contemporary times. And I would like to read out the first question from Małgorzata Pakier, who asks about the portraits of Poles as pigs in Spiegelman's comic, and on the portrait of the translator in Showa by Lanzmann. And the question goes, wouldn't you agree that it rather reflects on the stereotypization of Poles as witnesses in the popular discourse, either as mocked, as in the case of pigs, or as dismissed, as in the case of the translator blurred face figures?
Let me take this one. Can you hear me? Yeah. Well, to give you a very straightforward answer to this, the portrait of a pig pole after Spiegelman, painted by Sasnal, is actually not painted from any particular frame in Art Spiegelman's comic book, but it is a kind of like this distillation from several images of those poles or pigs in the comic, turned into something like nearly like a photograph for an ID, you know, for a passport or something like that. And Sasnal also said to me that he very much at the time when he was making this painting, he also thought about it intensely as his possible self-portrait, you know. So it's not so much a reflection on stereotypization of Poles as witnesses, but I suppose it is more trying to, identify with the way of with the way Spiegelman, gave roles, or arranged this kind of role-playing game in order to tell the history of his family, and to tell the larger history in which it is buried.
What about the translator's blurred face in Landsman's showa?
Well, the blurred face of the translator has to do with the fact that, and also she's kind of on the move, she's kind of like dynamic in this painting. So there's a blur, but it's also like a slight, she's sort of like sliding through the picture, or maybe she moved her head. So it looks like a long exposure of a photograph where, the image is not sharp, not in focus. And I think this has to do with her position, not only as a translator, but also as a kind of transitional actor or agent in this process, because she is supposedly neutral, not taking sides. So she's between Claude Lanzmann on the one hand and the bystanders / perpetrators / witnesses, call them however you want. And she's supposed to translate from Polish to French for Lanzmann, and from French to Polish for his interviewees. And she's slightly inflecting both the questions and the answers, because sometimes the questions are too nasty, and sometimes the answers are, she anticipates, too painful. So the process of translation is a process of interpretation, and maybe it's also a process that involves a good deal of distortion of literal message. And I think the sort of formlessness that sort of lurks into or lurches into this painting is kind of standing for this difficulty and kind of inbuilt impossibility of the true translation in this case. Because when you listen to those statements with Polish as your mother tongue, you kind of see the whole range of cultural references, the sound of the language, the type of words used. In translation, everything gets slightly simplified, flattened, and maybe good so.
Maybe it's also important to add that in the short guide for the exhibition, there are drawings of Sasnal, which are commentaries upon his paintings, or they are put in a kind of dialogue with the paintings from the exhibitions. So the guide, the little guide for the exhibition is a kind of, let's say, yes, an art statement on its own. And here you see that the translator has face. And for me, it's very important. She has face. She's a very defined figure. Her subject position is also different than in these paintings painted in 2003.
Okay, thank you, Luisa. Thank you, Adam. We have another question from Ruta Kauslaskaite. What is the popular reception of Wilhelm Sasnal's art in Poland, and how is the work received by the current right-wing government?
What is the popular reception? Well, he's quite popular because he did few works that were like record covers, and he's one of the very few painters who sort of got out of the art ghetto and became part of like his images are circulating as posters, as book covers, as record covers, and they kind of function in very there is a mural that he created lately in Warsaw that represents Jacek Kuroń, who's an amazing left-wing kind of figure of the anti-communist opposition. And then he, after the change in 1989, he became a minister of labor. And Sasnal made a large mural portraying Jacek Kuroń right now in the middle of the city. So his paintings are, his works, his drawings are known. He also produced cartoons. And he made films, so he kind of found a way to go outside of the kind of museum/gallery context. And he's maybe one of the very few, if not the only, Polish artist who is kind of present in the kind of popular imaginary. And for the other part of the question, I don't know how his work is received by the current right-wing government. I don't think that this is in any way relevant. Probably you are hinting at the fact that his work might not be appreciated by this government, but I don't think that this government is busy with art or culture in any other way than just purely trying to instrumentalize it when it's possible. And this stuff is very difficult to instrumentalize. So they kind of, I suppose, helpless. And as they go down, they might, look at it with certain melancholy, but I don't think that they would ever bother.
Lisa, do you want to add something? No. Okay, so Paweł, next questions, please.
So the next question comes from Eliza Kriza. And it goes like that. Some of the black and white images remind me of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy's photographs, in particular the image with the spoons and forks, but also other images which have an almost photographic quality. Do you know if Sasnal was influenced by Moholy-Nagy, or is this similarity just a coincidence?
I don't have a knowledge of him having been influenced by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, but I think that there is an influence of a certain, let's say, militant phase in European, avant-garde, and Moholy-Nagy is part of that period. So like 1920s up to early 1930s, and certainly photography and film from that period, the kind of constructivist or post-constructivist cinema, and the idea of montage and photomontage is of some influence. But I think that he is taking his visual cues from such a variety of sources that I would not say that he was influenced by Moholy-Nagy in particular. He rather used the spray paint to hint at something super contemporary, just throwing objects against the surface of the canvas that he did 15 years before to transform it. And I think it's rather this kind of alteration which is interesting here, that you kind of add another layer to something that is actually already historically and in terms of the source, complicated and appropriated, because this is the Art Spiegelman by Wilhelm Sasnal, and then it's like Spiegelman by Sasnal, again redone by Wilhelm Sasnal in an entirely different poetics or stylistics, however you wish.
Louisa, would you like to add anything?
No, maybe, that it's a constellation of visual sources, yes, it's a cloud. So maybe there is also Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, why not? But there are so many of these sources, also vernacular culture, popular culture, art history, that I think we would have to make a lexicon for this exhibition to list all of that.
Thank you. And we have another question of Zosia Wójcicka. Luisa Nader mentioned the short stories of Tadeusz Borowski as one of the reference points of Sasnal's work. Could you mention an example, and can we see it in one of the works discussed?
I take this one. So I'm not sure if I should reveal which of the short story is it. There are two short stories Adam was mentioning, considering these two images, untitled images, Borowski. I would like to stress the fact that the juxtaposition of these two images is very rare because they are in separate collections. So the fact that they are mirroring each other in this exhibitional space is really extraordinary, and there are so many ways of interpreting them. So they are referring to two short stories of Tadeusz Borowski, but I don't want to, burn this kind of interpretational trait. I think that Sasnal's painting is this kind of artistic practice where seeing is connected with knowledge. Knowledge triggers seeing, and seeing is requesting for knowledge. They are in a very mutual relation. So I think that the task which is being triggered by these two paintings is to look through Borowski again and to look for these little traits. And I did it, and honestly, this little dialogue put in this one of these images is exceptional, and it opens completely new ways of interpreting this this image. So I will not tell you which two short stories there are, but you should believe me. There's a reference point in Tadeusz Borowski's works.
Okay, so the next question comes from Joachim Sabelsberg, and it goes like that. Do you experience or see a tension between the concern with aesthetics on the part of artists and the subjects represented by the artists?
I'm not sure if it's about my experience or our experience of tension. Like it's kind of like mediated experience that you're describing, like me experiencing a tension that has to do with concern with aesthetics, I guess, on part of the artist and the subject represented. So I don't think that these are two separate things, first of all, and I think that we know pretty well, at least since Catherine David did her documenta in 1997, that politics and poetics are, twins, ugly twins. That's one thing, and I suppose if one would think of like aestheticization of let's say political or historical subject matter, there has to be a form found for a statement to be intelligible. So I suppose the choice of artistic form is never neutral, and in case of Sasnal, it is quite decidedly opting for images that are found, or they are coming from elsewhere. They are not, you know, conceived in the artist's mind or imagination or whatsoever. But all those images that we have seen, including the most abstract of them, which is the after image, they are coming from very specific sources, you know, from cultural experience and from kind of like physiology and psychology of perception. So they have their analogs in the actually existing world, and they are not, you know, creations of artistic imagination that kind of sell to one particular type of aesthetics. It's like aesthetics is employed and kind of redeployed in order to carry certain content. And I guess this is true for every work of literature, film, you know, cinema, and any kind of articulation, let's say. And I think I would not really make a kind of distinction of, or kind of produce like a kind of antagonizing relationship between aesthetics on the one hand and content on the other. I think the one helps the other to find a language, you know, to find a way of articulating.
Okay, I want to ask the question. I'm fascinated by the figure of Bożena Janicka, Landsman's interpreter, who mediated between the bystanders and the filmmaker, softening a message full of resentment and rejection on the one hand, and anti-Semitic gestures and statements on the other. And her position is special and difficult. And I wonder, however, it is a figure. This figure is not the key to understanding the position of Sasnal himself, who tries to mediate and translate voices. The question is, which voices? The voice of the dominant narrative, the Jewish voice of the victims, perhaps the historical politics wrapped around these figures. What does Sasnal actually translate?
Okay, Adam is mute, so I guess it's my turn. Well, it's a very complex question. So I think that Sasnal paintings and Sasnal's films are not translating only one voice. So they are multi-directional, and they are also polysemic and polyphonic, I would say. So it's a more complicated position. I think it's a transgenerational, intersubjective, transsubjective attempt to translate and to understand, perhaps. Not to explain, but just to understand. So I think there are many, many voices. There are voices of the victims. I think this is the most important voice. There are voices of witnesses, Jewish witnesses. They are voices of post-victims, post-witnesses. And they are also this very shameful enunciations of bystanders and of aggressors, bystanders who happen to be perpetrators. And there are many, many more subject positions. I think it's for the whole, book to analyze it. But this is what fascinates me in these works. This kind of a very complex attempt to understand a very complex terrain of memory, forgetting, coding, decoding, excluding, and explaining. So that would be my, very kind of provisionary answer for this very important question. Thank you, Kasia. Adam, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily identify, the position of the author, in this case, the painter, with the position of, I mean, yes, we can expand the notion of translation or interpretation quite far, but at a certain point we have to also see that it's basically his voice and the voice of his generation that we hear, and this is the generation that is confronting the Holocaust through images and through stories, published and heard stories. So I guess his work is also a kind of an attempt to personally react to complete spectacularization and mediatization of the experience, which is very typical for the generation that has come of age in the 90s, which is on the one hand after the political change in the country, but also there's a kind of larger change that has to do with internet and the kind of globalization of the experience. And I think that this work, through the variety of sources from which it is drawing, is also a kind of evidence of this state of mind and being that is characteristic of Sasna's generation, which is now, people who are close to 50, born in the 70s, in a different political system, and kind of underwent a kind of education in history that is very different to what we could learn after 1989. Yeah, so there's kind of also different versions of history or teaching history that are kind of clashing and competing in the minds of this generation, and there are constantly new calls to see things in a different light. And these paintings are also like quick reaction to the ongoing debates, to books that are published or to facts that are revealed. And this is the history of last 20 years, let's say, recorded in these works.
Unfortunately, this is all the time we have for a discussion. I would like to thank Louisa and Adam again for this very inspirational, very interesting interpretational guided tour, for them answering the question. I would like to thank my co-hosts for hosting our first panel of the conference. I would like to thank all the participants for their questions, for participating, for joining us and for viewing, and see you during next sessions of our conference. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Zosia, for our technical moderation. So, see you next time in other panels. Thank you.